Thank you very much. You guys know that you're going to be on 60 Minutes. I'm just kidding. We have a crew here from 60 Minutes, so those of you who don't want to fall asleep in the middle of be on your good behavior. Listen, it's noticeably fewer people here today. It must have been a lot of fun last night. I'm sure by about 11, people will roll in, pretending that they went out for the break. Oh yeah, I just went out for the break. Coming back in. You all have done that trick, I know. I've used it myself. All right, so listen, I have about 5 days worth of content, and I've got about 2.5 hours to talk about this stuff. And I think I mentioned yesterday that I always have a struggle with what I'm going to talk about, because so many of the things that I think so many of the things that we are working on have potential relevance for your work. There's a couple things that I think are really, really important and really, really common in children who end up in the child welfare system and ultimately either foster care, permanence, or guardianship, or adopted. And one of the areas where there's sort of pervasive challenge is around forming relationships. How they create relationships and how those relationships progress and mature and are maintained or not. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And yesterday I talked a little bit about sort of stress and the stress response systems and how a little bit about that, and because that's also another very common area of difficulty with many of these kids, is that their stress response systems are abnormally regulated. And the consequences of that are myriad. That impacts their health, that impacts their social, emotional, cognitive, motor skills, and so forth. And because of that, these kids are really a challenge to anybody who's trying to help them grow up. So I introduced a little bit yesterday about some of the interesting and I think important aspects of the biology of the stress response. And I mentioned that I was going to come back and talk a bit about the complexities that we're dealing with regards to the brain. And so let me just take a tiny little moment to once again help you remember how important the brain is and how complex it is. And I do this for two reasons. One is that I think it's really important to remember that you're going to hear from all kinds of people about what is true. And I want to remind you that what we're talking about, human behavior, and the neuroscience that is involved in some human behaviors is so complex that nobody has the answer. There isn't an answer. Human beings are so complex, and there are so many different variables that go into how you're functioning in this moment with this person, that it really is a disservice to say, oh, his serotonin is low, or I just need to get to his dopamine system, or we need to just do bilateral stimulation and then everybody will be regulated. It's just not true. We are very complex. Now, the reason I don't usually talk about this complexity up front is that it's overwhelmingly intimidating. Many of you who have probably either read articles or been to meetings where people start throwing out terms like, the lateral prefrontal cortex and the amygdala and the locus coeruleus and D2 receptors and GDP coupling, and well, maybe not that, and you hear this stuff and it becomes the jargon of sort of the new high priesthood, that these people over here know all about this and you don't. And it leads people to, I think, sometimes avoid learning about the brain. And I just want to tell you this, that you can actually appreciate the complexity of the brain without having to memorize everything there is to know. And you can learn very, very important principles about the brain and how it changes without being a neuroscientist. And that's kind of the balance that we're going to try to do here. So, yesterday I talked about some of these principles, right? I mean, we talked about the sequential processing of information. We talked about, you really have to regulate somebody before you can connect with them, and that the best way to get to the cortex is to have this relational connection. Now, obviously, I'm articulating a principle, but I'm going to back up now, and we're going to talk a little bit about just a tiny little bit about this neuroscience, because I want you to appreciate a little bit about the complexity of this. And so you don't walk out of here thinking like you know it all, or I know it all, or anybody knows it all. Because one of the hardest things about families that are seeking help is that they're hungry for an answer. And many of you have probably seen this with the families you work with. What's the diagnosis? What's the diagnosis? What's the right medication? What is the treatment? And I hate to tell you, there's no magic bullet out there. This is, and once you learn more about how the brain changes, you'll be able to accept the fact that the process of helping these kids grow up is hard work. And it requires repetition, and it requires the creation of an optimal developmental milieu that has certain characteristics. And it's ideally you want that environment to be present at home and in the school and in the community. And what that means is you might be able to do that in your home. And a lot of you have seen this happen. A parent or a family can really create a safe, nurturing environment that accepts the challenges that the child has, accepts the fact that this kid's 12 years old, but he acts like he's 4. And that's okay, because they figure out how to meet the child where the child is. And then they have to send them off to school. And the school completely misunderstands them and punishes them because they're not acting like they're 12. And it leads to a cascade of problems that the child then carries back home. And so the challenges. It's not about taking that child and finding the right thing. So let's appreciate the complexity, and then I'm going to back up and we'll talk about some more principles that may be helpful in your work. All right, so excuse me. First thing, I just want you to know that everything that I say from this point forward, and everything I said yesterday is not true. It's not true. It's, we're trying to get at something, but because of the complexities of human existence, everything that we try to explain and reduce to a few principles and concepts and facts for you literally makes it in some way not true. However, it doesn't mean that it's not helpful. So let's go back to this. This is sort of the drawing of the brain. Remember this? I said, the brain is important, and if you understand what's under the hood and how the brain works and develops, you'll be understand these kids a lot better. And I showed you this brain, and you're like, oh yeah, that's a brain. And I said, the top part of the brain here, is involved in these complex human functions like thinking and speech and language, and then the lower parts of the brain down here are involved in regulating heart rate and blood pressure, and there's a hierarchy of function. As you get higher in the brain, is increasingly complex in structure and mediating increasingly complex functions, and wow, you get it. But I just would ask you, is this really what the brain looks like? Anybody ever seen a human brain? Does it look like that? No. Nobody's brain is invisible. Nobody's brain has colored parts, right? This is a model. Now the question is it helpful? Yes, it captures something that's really useful. It helps you understand that inside this, if you looked at this, you'd just see the outside of the brain. But this helps you understand that there are structures inside the brain. It helps you understand a lot of things about the connectivity of your sensory apparatus, like your eyeball to the brain. It's really useful for teaching, but it's not completely true. So, your brain is comprised of lots of bits. You have 86 billion, I used to say 100 billion neurons, because there are people that study this, and then they have meetings and they have arguments over whether or not it's 86 or 100 and so forth. And, it's a legitimate area of research. I can't imagine spending my life doing that, but 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm just kidding. So the current thinking is there's like between 86 and 88 billion neurons, and there's still some discussion about that. But that's, for our purposes, it really is just basically that's just a lot. It's a lot of neurons. And neurons are specialized cells, and these cells are specialized basically to be continually responsive to incoming signals from other cells, mostly from other neurons. And the way this happens, of course, many of you have heard about this, is you probably know, some may know more about it than I do, through what we call neurotransmission, where one cell comes up against the next, and there's a presynaptic component that releases a chemical, or chemicals, usually multiple actually, substances like norepinephrine, dopamine, enkephalin, endorphin. You've heard of these things, right? Oxytocin is a neuromodulator in some parts of the brain. And so we have all these things that they go across this space we call a synapse. Now, this is a drawing of synapse, and you've got a lot of these, right? You've got 1 billion of them in just a cubic centimeter of brain tissue. Now, again, I would ask you, do you think this is really what a synapse looks like? This is wrong. This is a model. It's a drawing. You don't have any lighty up things in your brain. There's no lighting up. It's like, you don't have light bulbs going off. And, and this is wrong too. You don't have, look at that. I have little things going on over here. This is a cartoon. But it's an attempt to convey something that is true. It is true that neuronal interconnectivity is dynamic. And it is true that most neural networks create this web like this of interconnection with lots of other neurons. And so in many ways, it's useful for you creating in some imagery about what's going on in the brain. And it gets even more complex, right? So you can actually open one of these up and look at how many parts there are in there. There's all kinds of structural parts inside the synapse. And there are proteins that are involved in a whole bunch of different things, and you can actually magnify that, and you'll get this, and then this, and then this, and then these are just different component proteins. And the reason I'm showing you this isn't really because I want you to know about these proteins in your intrasynaptic, in the intracellular matrix of the presynaptic terminal. I want you to appreciate the complexity of human beings. I want you to resist simple explanations, because there are going to be people out there that are going to try to explain your child and the challenges they're having in an overly simplistic way, and they're going to want to be categorical, and you need to take what's useful from what they're saying and use it, and the other stuff, ignore it. And that's sometimes very hard to do without a little bit of knowledge. So the more you learn, the more we engage in what we call capacity building, the better you will be at separating the wheat from the chaff, separating the baby from the bathwater, because the truth is, you've all been asked by somebody, either a professional or a teacher or somebody else, you've all been asked to abandon something that you know is true about this child, right? When they say, hey, here's what you need to do. You need to have a thing where there's consequences for their behavior, and if they do this, then we'll punish them this way. And you're like, oh, whoa, 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 whoa. And you cringe when they start telling you this, but well, they're the expert. We'll come back and talk a little bit about that in a minute, but let's go talk about this. So, if you take the brain and you look at how many neurons there are and how many what we call glial cells there are, and then you look at how many synaptic connections there are, and then you remember that these synapses are continually dynamic. You're inside your brain, it's not lighting up, but you're continually having the release of neurotransmitter, and you're having all kinds of intracellular communications and neurotransmission going on, and your brain is completely dynamic. And because all of these dynamic activities lead to intracellular changes in what parts of the genome get turned on and off, you are literally different as a human being from moment to moment to moment through your entire life. You are never exactly the same from 1 second to the next. It's pretty cool. It's kind of exciting, right? When you think about it. But because we are so continuously changing, it makes it we're harder to understand. There's a lot going on inside a human being. And so think about it. 2.5 quadrillion depolarizations or neuronal firings per minute. That's stunning. That's complex. And that's just the complexity of the child or the individual as you reduce one person and look at one organ. Let's start looking at the fact that human beings, as we talked about yesterday, we're not really a species that is meant to be completely a standalone species. We are interdependent. Human beings are neurobiologically interconnected to others. In fact, huge parts of our body and brain, our fundamental sensory apparatus, are all about connecting to other people. The lowest divisible unit of the species is the group. And so there's all kinds of complexity and dynamic that gets introduced by interpersonal interactions. And I mentioned it yesterday. One of the wonderful, amazing qualities of human beings is that we have this contagion, that human beings are contagious. We have this neurobiology of reading and responding to other people in specific ways. Ultimately, this was at its core related to survival. So our stress response systems are intimately interconnected with the neurobiology of connectivity, of relational interaction. And it should be no surprise to you then when you look at the number one factor that's associated with protecting people from stressors in the present, right? We're in the midst of a chaotic environment. We're having a fire in Napa. We're having a hurricane in Houston. We're having Katrina. We're having war. The number one factor that protects people in those environments is actually how well they're connected to the people around them. And then the number one factor that's associated with healing from previous developmental trauma is, guess what? Oh, application of an evidence-based practice? Bullshit. It has almost nothing to do with recovery. Recovery and healing from trauma has to do with connectedness. It has to do with how well you're connected to healthy people in your world. Family, community, culture. Now, we're really complex, this relational stuff that we have, and I'll come back and we'll hone in and look at this a little bit in a minute. But I want to introduce a little bit of an appreciation for the complexity of studying and understanding human connectivity. If you take one person and you start to look at all of the different groups that they are interacting with and that they're part of over the course of a week, it gets incredibly complex. If you just take 8 people in a group, that's the only 8 people, you put them in a group, the truth is there's like over 3,000 potential conformations, configurations of alliances, of grouping and interacting that are possible. This is stunning. And that's just in the present. See, as you all know, we actually have connection to people in the past that have influenced how we function. That's why we're here. I mean, we're talking about how bad things, adverse things happened in the past of these kids, most of which were relationally mediated, that impact how they're functioning in the present. And we all know that if we don't do a good job at helping them divert out of an unhealthy developmental trajectory, when they become parents, they're going to pass on some of that same negative stuff to their children. And so we know that we're not just connected to people in the present, there's a connectivity to people in the past. And so this transgenerational process of how we become adds, I don't want to say infinite, but it adds astounding complexity. And again, so whenever you hear these overly simplistic perspectives about how somebody got to be some way, just remember that there can be some interesting and truth in what that person is saying, but it still may not be true. So, enough philosophy for the day. Let's go talk about the brain. All right. So, brain's complicated. You pick up on that yet? Let's talk about early developmental experiences. So here's a couple of things that I think many of us are battling against. And I could show you a bunch of data from our research, and it probably wouldn't mean the same thing. But I just want you to appreciate that so much of the organization of these fundamentally important networks in our brain that are involved in forming and maintaining relationships, that are involved in regulating us, so many of these things develop early in life. And I'm going to talk about this for a second. I want to talk about the creation of these really important memories or associations that we create early in life as a function of our history of relational experiences. And so before I do that, I have to back up a second and do just a little bit about memory. Now, most people think about memory sort of like they're really thinking of a component of memory. So when you think about memory, most of us are thinking, oh, where did I leave my keys? You know, can I memorize all the presidents? We're thinking about cognitive aspects of memory. But memory is a unique biological property that allows us to carry forward in time some change in the way we are functioning that is related to an experience. And so there's lots of different kinds of memory. You know, when you get in shape, you know, you go lift weights and you kind of do a whole bunch of things. Here's the experience of putting a moderate, predictable stress on a muscle. Your muscle actually gets the signal to grow more proteins and stuff and make more actin and myosin and make you stronger. So you literally have a stronger muscle that is a memory of a previous experience. When you get your immunization when you're a little child and you are 20 years old and you're carrying around in your body sort of the white cells that have the ability, the memory of exposure to one of these antigens, and then they can fight off an infection, that's a form of memory. It's a cellular change that has occurred in response to an experience that you carry forward in time. Now, no tissue is more specifically, if you will, specialized to create memory than neurons. Neurons, that's their job, is to be continually responsive to the microenvironmental cues they're getting, which in turn are caused by the macro environmental cues that you're getting through your sensory apparatus. And so your brain is continually bombarded in incoming information. And it's trying to make sense out of the world. We talked about that a little bit yesterday. And it's making memory. So one of the things that your brain does to make this memory is, you probably heard about this, I mentioned this yesterday, is that you can make memory by sort of changing how certain neurons are connected. And so you'll have synaptic connectivity can be involved in memory. And it can also be how close the synapse is and how much area there is in the synapse. And there's a lot of, if you will, micro-architectural changes that take place when you make a memory. But here's kind of what happens. When you are a newborn and your brain has never seen, a certain image, the first time your brain gets all of the neural activity that corresponds to that specific image, there's a unique cascade of activity that flows through your brain. It's unique, and your brain has never seen this pattern of activity. And if it's present with sufficient frequency, your brain will start to make associations and create a network that becomes what we call a memory. So right now, and I haven't really heard it because my brain has been internalizing it, processing, and shutting it down. I would bet that if we're all really quiet right now, we'll all hear some background noise related to the ventilation in this room. Now, I can kind of hear it. I don't know if you guys can. Right? Can you hear it? Have you ever seen a baby when you bring them into a room and they kind of go, they look like they just smoked pot? They're like, they're trying to figure out what the hell that is. They're like, where is that sound coming from? They're trying to make an association between, this is new. I've never heard this sound before. And they're paying attention to it. Or have you ever seen them? I remember every once in a while looking into the crib with my kids and they'd be looking at their hand like, oh. And you're like, oh, wow, what's wrong with my kid? But it's there. We've seen our hands a million times. So when we see it, it's like, whatever. Our brain goes, been there, done that, no big deal. But when something's new, your brain activates the stress response, right? And so the first step along that activation of that stress response, we talk about the fight or flight response. It's really not the fight or flight response. The first step is what we call flock. And flock is social referencing. And the reason we socially reference is that we're relational creatures. And so we look to see, are we safe? Are you hearing this? And so this is kind of what happens when you're sitting in a meeting at work and you're hanging out with everybody, and in comes your supervisor, and your supervisor goes, you know what? We've got a big grant coming up, so nobody can take vacation for the next 2 months. And you look at each other, you're like, what the hell? And you do social referencing. You look at the person next to you and you're like, can you believe this shit? Now, you're not saying that, but you're like, looking at them like, that's social referencing. That's the first step along this arousal continuum. And you're like going, wow, you think this is as stupid as I do? And of course, you're waiting in that group. You're waiting for the person with the least executive functioning. Right? You want some, but Bob is going to say something. Come on, Bob. Say it's bullshit. Come on. You're all hoping Bob says it so you don't get in trouble. But Bob, so that's sort of how, neurosociology works, right? So, but that first step is sort of social referencing. So you look around, and that's kind of what happens when your brain gets, as a baby, this new signal of what is this ventilation stuff? And every time you want to come into this certain room, you hear this ventilation. And repetition, and every time you're in mom's arms and you're safe and comfortable and mom doesn't act like there's anything going on. And what did I tell you about social referencing yesterday? That the major determinant of how you activate your stress response is the relational milieu. And so if mom acts like nothing's going on, every time you hear this sound, pretty soon your brain internalizes a memory and associates it with no threat. And then the next time you hear it, and hear it again and again and again and again, you don't make a brand new memory. Nobody has made a brand new memory about ventilation sounds in this room in the last 2 days, right? So what your brain has done is got a template. It's got the original stored memory associated with hearing ventilation, and anything that's similar to that afterwards is just It comes in the lower part of your brain, remember? It gets matched against previously stored ventilation sound, and your brain categorizes that as neutral and ignore it. And so literally for 50 years in my life, I've been getting that sound in my head every day, and I've been completely ignoring it. And it has been doing nothing except episodically reinforcing and keeping that memory intact. That's a template memory. So your brain doesn't have enough hard drive space to make a brand new memory about every single experience. Right? So, the solution is that the brain makes an original template memory based upon the first set of experiences with that issue, and then anything that's similar to that comes in afterwards is compared to that. And if it's similar enough, your brain basically categorizes it as that. So, again, not to be crude, but everybody in this room is sitting on your rump. And you're getting signals from, receptive neurons in your rear end that are telling you that you have a certain pressure and you're in a certain position in space, and you're sending signals up to the lower part of your brain, and your lower part of your brain is literally taking that in, going, all right, I've got butt-sitting memory. I know that means that I have to stimulate this, spinal nerve a little bit here and this spinal nerve here to keep me in balance and that kind of stuff. And that's why you're not just falling over. But you all remember the first time you took your little one, right, your little baby, and tried to sit them up. They're like, whoa, and they plop over. Because they didn't have butt-sitting memory yet. Well, or as scientists, motor vestibular, whatever. But and the point, again, I'm trying to just emphasize this point, that your brain is filled with memories that you created based upon your earliest experiences that create your version of how the world works. And we have this not just for sitting and not just for ventilation. We have this for relationships. And essentially, everybody in this room has used the term attachment. People write about it, people do all kinds of stuff, and there's, people have a lot of different ways that they explain it. But in my mind, attachment is essentially that set of template memories that you've created that are relational based upon your history of early relationships. And it's created by those first relational interactions. If you had a combination of early caregivers, grandma, auntie, mom, they have contributed to your attachment capabilities. So, let's talk a little bit about this. Remember this? Good. Now, remember this? And remember this. Now, here we go. This is little newborn baby in here. I'm in utero, hanging out. It's warm, I'm not cold, I'm not hungry, I'm not thirsty, I'm regulated, and my brain is developing. And my little fetal brain is developing, and I have this whole set of experiences that are starting to be stored, because the capacity to make memory exists in utero. And so you literally are born with a whole set of memories. These are really core memories. Now, I don't mean that, oh yeah, I remember that time when mom was got in that argument with her friend, and you don't remember that stuff. And lower parts of your brain create synaptic connections. Middle parts of your brain, and even a few top parts of your brain, you're creating associations which are memory. So here you are, and I mentioned yesterday that one of the most important sets of memories that you create have to do with connecting rhythm with regulation. So you're getting all of this incoming input from your own little fetal body that says, listen, I'm not hungry, I'm not thirsty, I'm not cold, and you're getting all this incoming neural activity that's coming from the outside world, and which is determined by mother. And so the mother's heart rate and the beating of the mother's aorta and the vibration and the movement and the auditory input creates this multi-sensory and that is associated and connected with being regulated. And this is where the somatosensory rhythm I talked about yesterday is something that for almost everybody is a regulating experience. And that as you get older, that gets reinforced by all kinds of other pattern, repetitive, rhythmic things. You're rocked at a certain frequency. You're stroked in the back of the head at certain frequencies. You engage and have eye contact and soothe the baby, and then you disengage, and then you re-engage, and then you disengage. And all this stuff is rhythmic. So all of that's happening here. You've got this original template, and then you get born. So being born involves a whole bunch of things that are going to basically activate your stress response. Number one, you're going to have a period of time where you have less oxygen because you're transitioning from being connected to mother and then not being connected. Number two, it's going to be painful. And I know a lot of people have weird ideas about the fact that babies, they feel pain. So babies, they feel pain. They have lack of oxygen. And then one of the major things is this sensory transition from a world that's warm and dark to a world that is cold and filled with light. And all of that base section that's been regulating and that's been ever present for the entire life is now not there. And so the transition from being in utero to being born is the largest sensory transition you will ever take place in your entire life. And because of that, it leads to this incredibly robust and multidimensional stress response. And so every single stress capability, every single component of the stress response you have is recruited to help you make that transition. And again, I hope that after yesterday you appreciate that I don't believe stress in and of itself is bad. In fact, I think that this stress activation at birth is not only not bad, it's good. It's necessary to make that transition and survive. So it's a good thing that we recruit these systems, but one of the results is that the baby is going to be up in this high arousal state. And one of the things that we do to help them sort of go from this really high state is, and get down to a more regulated state, is to replicate intrauterine sensory cues. We swaddle them up, we turn the lights down, we talk differently, sometimes we rock them, and we rock them at a frequency that soothes them, and the frequency that soothes them will be either the primary rhythm or a submultiple rhythm of what they heard in utero, and they'll get back down into this state. And so they'll go down this arousal continuum and they'll be better regulated. And the problem is, because they're no longer getting nonstop calories, what happens? They start to get feedback from their body that says, hey, I'm not getting any glucose anymore. What's that all about? I'm not sure I'm in on this deal. And the baby feels a sensation that the baby's never had before. And what does novelty do to the stress response system? Activates it, right? So novelty activates the stress response system. And what happens when you activate the stress response system and you're asleep? You wake up. And what happens when you wake up? You open your eyes. And what happens when you open your eyes, if you're a baby and you've never seen the world before except when you went through that birthing thing, your brain goes, oh my God, what is this? And that's more novelty. And so then the baby does the equivalent of the the baby's fight or flight response, which is to grunt and groan and wiggle and squiggle and cry. And then, of course, if the caregiver is present, attentive, attuned, and responsive, they will take the baby up in his or her arms. Let's pretend it's mom, her arms. And she will make some judgment. She will say, oh, I think you're hungry, or I think you're cold, or I think you're scared, or whatever the interpretation of that behavior is, the mother will try to be responsive. Now, usually, after a couple of guesses, you get it right. And you meet the need of the infant. And when you meet the need of the infant, part of what happens, let's pretend the infant was hungry, and when you feed the infant, all of a sudden you stop getting those dysregulating signals from your body that say, I don't have enough calories. And you become more regulated. Follow? All right. Now, regulation. So you do this 1,000,000 times. And I'm not kidding. 1,000,000 times. Again and again and again and again, baby's cold, hungry, thirsty, pick me up. And half the time they just want to be held, because being held is just as important for the infant as food, which is an interesting, I don't even want to go into our culture, but the reality is we completely misunderstand the importance of touch in our culture. Touch is as essential to an infant as calories. And I would actually argue in many cases more important. But what happens is, now, those of you who have been daydreaming and sort of going off into the really smart part of your brain and thinking about what I'm saying, and then thinking about yesterday, and then thinking about this, you've been recognizing, no doubt, because you're such a sharp audience, that this pattern of maternal presence, primary caregiver responsivity is a resilience building pattern. Essentially what's happening with the stress response system of this infant is that it's getting a moderate, and because every time the baby cries, guess who comes? The caregiver. Therefore it becomes predictable. And in the mind of the child, controllable, right? So the interesting thing is, the infant responding to a newborn in this attentive way, i.e. picking up the crying baby, isn't spoiling the baby. It's making the baby resilient. Babies who are picked up and attended to in a consistent, predictable way are much more capable of building in a stress response capability that can tolerate hunger, thirst, cold, and novelty better than a child who gets unpredictable responsivity. So this is a tolerance building pattern of activity that's essentially like this. And so if this is the baseline level of regulation that the infant was born with right here, and let's say this is birth and it's pretty dysregulating, and every time I get hungry, thirsty, and cold, every time I get somebody comes, pretty soon the next time I have a major stressor, instead of going up to this level of activation, I just go to this level of activation. I'm i.e. resilient. This is a tolerance building, resilience building pattern of responsivity. This is a wonderful thing. Now later on when I talk about therapeutics, this is a therapeutic pattern of interacting with somebody as well. But let's go a little bit further. Now let me just remind you about something I said yesterday. For a caregiver, let's say the mom, for mom to be present, attentive, and attuned like this to help build a resilient infant and ultimately a resilient child, you need to think about how hard it is to take care of a baby, right? So back in the day, when we had 30 or 40 people living in the same space of multiple generations, and there was one mother with a newborn baby, caregiving responsibilities were distributed amongst the community. Not, the mother didn't have to get all the food. The mother didn't have to take care of all of the other kids. The mother didn't have to clean the cave. The mother didn't have to do everything. But if you have a single mother with 3 kids, which is not an unusual situation in our modern world, this mother has to do all of the caregiving tasks and then somehow be this attentive, attuned, responsive caregiver to build resilience, which is an unrealistic ask. Nobody can do that. Even in a nuclear family that's, quote, healthy and intact and with economic resources, if you're a single caregiver during the day and somebody else is off working, it's an overwhelming task. Particularly if there are other children present who have to have their needs met. Now, if you start to add in stuff like, depression, you add in a domestic violence, you add in a previous history of the mother herself having less than ideal early caregiving, then you've got this cascade of problems, and it looks like this. So, here's what happens. You go through the same sequence, and the baby's born, and baby's hungry, but you got one mother. You got a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old. You've got the newborn in a bassinet in the back room of the apartment. Out in the front room, the TV's on because you're just trying to occupy the kids while you try to figure out what food you have and figure out, with your sore bottom, by the way, you're like 40 hours out of the hospital, and you're all sewn up, and you got one of those frickin' pillows to sit on, and you don't know if you're supposed to go, how am I going to go to the store? Because you live in a community that's so messed up that the closest walkable grocery store is like a mile away. And so you have to figure out who's going to come and watch my kids while I go to the grocery store, and you're screwed. You're screwed. I can't tell you how many times I've seen situations where there was an accusation of neglect, where it was a mother who was trying to go down to the corner store to get some cigarettes and some milk and cereal for the other kids, and one of the younger kids kind of opened the door and wandered out, even after they're told, and don't go out, don't leave, blah, blah, blah. They do. I'm not saying that's a great situation, but if you have a single isolated caregiver who's disconnected from her neighbors and her extended family and the rest of the community, and there's nobody there for her to do this, and I can tell you there's a lot of families like that, this stuff, it happens. That little girl that I showed you yesterday that had all those diagnoses that got sent off to the hotbed of psychiatric excellence, remember that? I won't mention the state, but she was one of those kids. She had a really loving grandmother who was really overweight, who had a really hard time chasing this kid around. And the child was an explorer. She went out and opened windows and opened doors and did all kinds of stuff. And one night the little kid woke up and heard a bunch of noise on the street. It sounded like it was kind of fun, and she crawled out the window and was wandering the streets of Philadelphia. And there were people out having sort of a block party down the way. And, it was like 2 a.m. And it was hot, in the summer days. That's people do that in lots of urban communities. And the little kid was curious, and so all of a sudden people are like, "Who's this?" They call the police call CPS, and they go after this grandmother, and this kid ends up in the system. And of course, you take a 3-year-old kid who doesn't know anybody, you put them in somebody else's house, and that's going to be dysregulated, you think? And so what does she do? She crawls out, every time she can, she tries to get away and get back to grandma's house. And so that one home couldn't handle her, because it's a danger. We can't have her. She's crawling out the windows at night, blah, blah, blah. So they send her to a psychiatric unit and ended up accumulating diagnoses. And you saw the medications, and it was off to the races with a completely inappropriate lens for what was going on with this child. And that went on for years. That went on for like 5 years before they finally sort of changed their understanding of this child. But in those 5 years, this kid had only seen the grandmother maybe once a year and had gone through 15 different placements and ended up in a state 2,000 miles away from her home. That's the way we do intervention currently. So, you get a parent like this, and the baby wakes up, it starts initially grunting around, but because the parent is out in the front with the other kids, what happens is this kid starts crying and then screaming bloody murder. And you know what babies are like. Once they get past a certain point, it's really hard to soothe them when they're gulping air. And so mom comes back, hears the baby screaming, comes back to the back room to take care of the baby, and the 3-year-old's on her hip. Like, who's that? What's that? What's that? And while she's trying to let down her milk, because she's been told breastfeeding's a great thing to do, right? So she's trying to let down her milk. Anybody, not like I've ever done this, but I've heard. So if you're tense and anxious, it's very hard to have a healthy letdown response. In fact, one of my first mentors was Niles Newton. You guys probably don't know who that is, but she's the woman who discovered the relationship between oxytocin and breastfeeding, and did a lot of the original oxytocin work. But she was one of my original mentors at Northwestern. And one of her experiments was to actually take lactating mothers and put their feet in ice cold water, which is a stressor. It's kind of weird where people come up with, hey, let's stress you this way. But let me just put your feet in ice cold water, by the way. Okay. And she demonstrated that those mothers could not have a letdown response and feed their babies. And so, anyway, this mom can't let down her milk, and so all of a sudden she says, screw breastfeeding, I'm just going to use a bottle. But the pattern of dysregulation has started. This mom is overwhelmed, she's exhausted, she's frustrated, and the pattern that you see here is, as I'm sure most of you recognize, this pattern. It's a sensitizing pattern. So here's these two kids who are born with the same capacity to regulate. One has a caregiver who has lots of support and other people to distribute the caregiving burden, and that child has the opportunity to become resilient, and the other child has a mother who's doing her very best but struggling in an environment with not enough resources and other kids and to help her with the kids, and that kid becomes sensitized. And what happens to the sensitized kid when they come to school? What happens to our sensitized kids when they come to school? Sensitized kids when they come to school are essentially labeled as impulsive, aggressive, etc., etc. Because, remember what I talked about yesterday? If you have a sensitized stress response, remember this? Let me go back and remind you. Here you are. You have a sensitized stress response, and what will happen is it changes the stress reactivity curve. It changes the stress reactivity curve so that when you are introduced to the normal novelty or challenge of a new social learning experience, a new cognitive learning experience, a new motor learning experience, guess what? Instead of being in an active alert state where you have part of the cortex available to internalize new content, you are in a dysregulated state where you have shut down your cortex and you don't learn this content as efficiently, and you need 10 times as many repetitions to learn the same thing. And so as a result, what happens is you are chronologically 5 when you enter pre-K, but because of the use-dependent, again, we talked about this yesterday, the brain changes in a use-dependent way, but because you've had far fewer equivalent repetitions in social, emotional, and cognitive domains. You might be 5, but functioning like you're 3. But because we don't do individualized planning about the strengths and vulnerabilities of kids as it regards to learning, we have one teacher and 20 kids we teach to the mean. And so the kids that have been exposed to this content and have mastered it previously, when they get taught about some topic, they're bored. And these kids down here are lost. And these kids in the red curve are the kids that come from the backgrounds I just described, where they've got these sensitized stress response systems that started from the moment they were little ones. And so even though they may have been in an environment where there was lots of opportunities for social modeling, for cognitive acquisition of content, they didn't internalize the content as quickly. And it's not because they couldn't, it's just because they were in a state that made it difficult for them to learn as efficiently as others. This is the achievement gap. The achievement gap is not about the color of your skin, it's about the state of your stress response system. And as I said yesterday, the sensitizing pattern of unpredictability that can occur in an environment of poverty, in an environment where you're a marginalized person in a majority population, both of those, independent of capital T trauma, will create a sensitizing pattern of stress response activation that leads to this kind of dysregulation. And over time, what happens is if you have 2 kids sitting in the same classroom, the child who's regulated and has their cortex open for business is going to learn more easily than the child who has their cortex partially shut down. And over time, there's a divergence in performance. And so here, we just kick these kids out of pre-K because they're a problem. Here, because we don't catch them up, and just by the way, even when we have a surveillance model to measure where kids are struggling, we still don't catch them up. This is what happens in our surveillance model around looking at cognitive acquisition of capabilities. We only catch up, 6 out of 100 kids? 6 out of 50 kids? Imagine, we don't do surveillance about social emotional development or about regulation. So we don't catch any of these kids up. We don't have any proactive way to divert them out of this trajectory. We let them struggle, and then we start to give them, using the lens of mental health, we start seeing them as pathological. You have attention deficit disorder. You have oppositional defiant disorder. You have some form of impulse control problem. And then we use our standard model of thinking and we start giving them medications. Or we start using other interventions that are not necessarily trauma aware or informed. And how effective are we at this? We're terrible at this. You look at the outcomes of a typical public mental health clinic, it's not only is it impossible, really hard to get in, it's almost impossible to stick. The average number of visits to a public mental health clinic before there's a rupture in treatment is about 2.5. The average waiting list at a public mental health clinic is about 3 months. And so these kids go underserved. And when they do get served, they're viewed with this sort of distorting lens. And then they get older. And the very same developmental problems that cause them to be kicked out of preschool and then labeled with mental health stuff gets them charged with truancy and assault in schools, and they enter the juvenile justice system. We could divert these kids out of this trajectory if we understood these issues. There are, I'm not going to use any names, but I finished my presentation yesterday and I was checking my email, and there you go. I get an email from somebody who's got a young man that they've adopted who in many ways is very wonderful, skilled, articulate, a good kid, but he spent a lot of his life in the child welfare system, going from place to place to place, and had trauma-related stuff and got in trouble with the law, and now he's in the adult criminal justice system. And it's one of these things that people are like, help. What can we do? And that's why we're here. So, let's go back and talk more about, let's talk a little bit more about this whole relationship between what happens in early life when you start to make these relational connections. So, what time is it here? 9:30. And what time are we taking a break? 10? Is that, where's the rule keeper? Was 10 yesterday? Are you guys all right? You doing okay with this? All right. So, let's go back and talk about this a little bit. So one of the things that happens, I've been talking to you a little bit like when you create sort of an association between patterns of neural activity that co-occur. I've been talking about it in a really simplistic way, like, oh my gosh, you make a very simple one synaptic connection association. It's way more complex than that, as you can imagine. And what I want to do is sort of talk to you about that complexity, and I'm going to do a little neuroscience on it. Don't be panicked, because you know that you can master this stuff. It's not that complex. But I want to present it because it will also help you understand why some of the therapeutic approaches that have been recommended for individuals who have maltreatment, trauma, and so forth, why some of these things have worked. So, simple reminder, if you look at the organization of the brain, one of the most important factors that I think it's really important to remember, these are facts. And the principle that flows out of this set of facts is absolutely frame shifting when it comes to behavior. I talked about it yesterday, and the reason I'm talking about it again, and I want to emphasize it again and again and again, it is because it is probably the single biggest neuroscience principle that will help you shed some of your biases about understanding the behavior of these kids. And that principle is that all experience, every single experience you have, has to be filtered initially through the lowest parts of your brain. Every single time you talk to somebody, every single time you hear something, it has to go through lower parts of your brain. Now, the consequences of that are, does that mean the break is at 9:45? Look at that. The smiley face is awesome. That's awesome. Thank you very much. Okay. So, now, all right, so here we go. Input from the body, the first place it stops is the lower parts of the brain. Input from the outside world, the first place it stops is lower parts of the brain. Again, you know this makes a lot of sense because the systems in your brain that are involved in mediating all of these different variations of the stress response originate in lower parts of the brain. Now I know, and you're going to hear from a million people about how the amygdala is involved in stress and threat and so forth, and it is. The amygdala is involved in interpreting threat-related cues. But the amygdala has no direct connection from the outside world. It does not, and so everything that the amygdala says you should do has to go through other systems, and everything that the amygdala is asked to interpret has to go through other systems. And one of the most important of these sort of inputs to the amygdala to help it sort of figure stuff out comes from the locus ceruleus, which is one of these important regulatory networks down here. So let's just keep this in mind, and let me just do this. This is a picture of the brain. This is a drawing of the brain. This is taking the brain and sort of cutting it down the middle, and then you're looking at it from the side. So this, let me just give you a little bit of orientation. This is the top parts of the brain, the cortical parts of the brain. This is the cerebellum. This is the sort of the limbic structures, the diencephalon's right in here. And so it's not exactly top to bottom to top, but that's kind of the way your brain is organized. So when you are in utero, your brain is getting all of this input I told you before from your body that's saying, I'm not hungry, I'm not thirsty, I'm not cold, and that causes a little bit of a cascade of neural activity that goes up through multiple parts of the developing brain. Now, in utero, your brain is developing very rapidly, but the top parts of your brain in particular are very undeveloped. The lower parts are more developed because at birth, you've got to be able to regulate your body temperature, right? You've got to be able to breathe. And so you have to sort of build that first in order for you to survive. But the part of your brain involved in speech and language and abstract cognition, you've got a lot of time to develop that. So all of what's happening in utero is that you're getting from the external sensory apparatus in the fetal body these pattern, repetitive, rhythmic inputs. And what it's doing is creating, if you will, the root system for the primary regulatory networks. And I say the root system because in many ways the regulatory network is like a big tree. You've got these fundamental regulatory networks, and then you have all of these other parts of the brain that these regulatory systems reach as you grow up. But it starts small and low, like a little root system, and then you have this central area that begins to grow. Now, after you're born, and this is kind of a complicated slide, but don't panic. This is my famous alien mother paperclip baby slide, which is, I think this slide's like 25 years old. When I was first trying to teach about these concepts, I was like, I couldn't really find good pictures. And back then, it was many of you, some of you are old enough to remember when they actually showed slides that were actually little slides, and you put them in a slide projector. And so it was harder to kind of make this stuff. So I drew a bunch of things, and most of them were pathetic, including this. But this basically is intended to convey the maternal-infant interaction. And this this green dot up here is sort of the neurobiology of healthy attachment. That mother has healthy neurobiology of relational engagement and for a lot of reasons. But let's say you've got a healthy mother and you've got a newborn baby that has yet to build in this relational neurobiology. So the little child there doesn't have any green yet. Now look over to this part. This is our little brain. This VTA D8, I'll just tell you what this is for kind of the neuroscience geeks in the room. Ventral tegmental area dopamine. So it turns out that there's a couple places in your brain that if you stimulate them, you'll have a sensation of pleasure. One of them is in the nucleus accumbens, and one of them is in the ventral tegmental area. So the nucleus accumbens is over here, and the ventral tegmental area is kind of here. And again, that doesn't really mean anything. Those of you who Yeah, just daydream, that's fine. It doesn't matter. But that's what this means right here, VTADA. Now, there are lots of ways that you can get a sensation of pleasure. And one of the most important and powerful ways of getting a sensation of pleasure is relieving physiological distress. And this is one of the most primitive forms of getting pleasure. It's actually, there's a yin and yang to sort of driving behavior in animals. And the yin is like, hey, I feel distressed because of something that's putting me at threat. That's why you feel distressed when you're hungry, thirsty, cold. And the yang is when you feel pleasure from having that distress relieved. And so as you sort of move up the animal kingdom in complexity, there are other components that are added into that reward system. And so there are many things that can give human beings reward, but certainly one of the most primitive and powerful forms of getting reward is to relieve distress. So, to the infant, when you feel the distress of hunger, thirst, and cold, what happens is, as I showed you, activate your stress response, you express your distress to your external stress regulator by crying with the hopes that they will come and feed you or flee with you or fight for you, but they have to be part of the stress response because you can't do it as an infant. If you get an attentive, attuned caregiver who comes and meets your fundamental needs and relieves your physiological distress, you get three things are happening. You're getting a whole cascade of sensory cues that are specific to that person, right? The way they smell, the way they look, the way they move, the way they touch you. And all of that's going into your brain at the same time that you're actually getting the neural stimulation that goes with being regulated because you're no longer hungry, no longer cold, and you're getting the neural stimulation that goes with reward. And so your brain starts to put together this three-part or triune association between regulation, reward, and relationship. And as most of you know, when you feel sort of upset and you reach out to a friend, it's regulating. When you have an opportunity to spend time at the break with friends talking, it's rewarding. I talked yesterday about why a 15-minute break is never a 15-minute break. It's because it's way more rewarding to sit out there and talk with each other than it is to sit in this room and listen to me talk. And so this capacity to get pleasure from interacting with another person has its roots in the way you were parented. If you had an attentive, attuned, and responsive caregiver who met your fundamental needs, your brain made an association between people and reward. And so later on, as you became an older child and you met another human being, and your internal template, i.e. your attachment, is such that human beings are regulating and rewarding, you would interact with that person as if they're going to meet your fundamental needs. And you greet them with a smile. You greet them with sort of nonverbal cues of social positive engagement. And of course, because human beings are contagious, what does that do? That elicits positive reciprocal interaction back. And so the interesting thing is, and I know that there's all kinds of philosophies out there about this, and almost every major philosophy says this in one way or another. You essentially elicit from the world what you project. If you expect the world to be harmful and threatening and everything else, your brain will essentially filter positive things out and seek out things and sometimes even project behavior that elicits negative feedback. In contrast, if you think the world is safe and people are good, you end up eliciting from people this positive reciprocal thing that reinforces your worldview. Let me give you an example from my own experience. I was in Chicago many, oh, is it time for the break now? Is it 9:45? All right, sorry. I was going to tell you this incredible story. But I am a rule follower. I'll tell you the story after you have a break. All right, go take a break.